Books. This is the third interview in the Borderless series. Back in December, I wrote to Becky Garcia and I said, would you guys be interested in this interview series? And I pitched it to her and she said yes. And it's been such a great space for these conversations. And if you have not checked it out, Malvern Books actually has a YouTube channel. And all of our interviews are up there as well as other events. So, and I really just want to encourage you to buy Natalia's book and buy lots of the books in here. You know, this is a time where independent bookstores like this really need to thrive, and there are so many books here you're not going to find anywhere else. Borderless Conversations on Art, Action, and Justice is about the power of words and the role of art in reflecting and changing our world. In this interview series, I talk to emerging and established artists, writers, about how and why they write and why it matters. What questions are they trying to answer, and how can the rest of us engage with those same questions in a way that enhances and deepens the dialogue and connects us more to one another and to the rest of humanity. So my third guest in the series is Natalia Sylvester. Natalia Sylvester is the author of the novels Chasing the Sun and Everyone Knows You Go Home, which was named a Best Book of 2018 by Real Simple. She studied creative writing at the University of Miami and is a faculty member of the low-res MFA program at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. Natalia's articles have appeared in Latina Magazine, Writer's Digest, the Austin American-Statesman, and NBCLatino.com. Born in Lima, Peru, she came to the U.S. at age 4 and spent time in South and Central Florida and the Rio Grande Valley in Texas before her family set roots in Miami, and she now lives and works in Austin. Natalia is going to begin with a short reading from her latest novel, Everyone Knows You Go Home. Everyone Knows You Go Home once spans 4 years of a young marriage and nearly 4 decades of a migrant family's history and secrets. It's every kind of story that I love. I just finished it this week, and it was a really profound emotional experience, which I'll talk about a little bit more, but it's a ghost story, it's a love story, it's a story about the cycles of life and death, and happiness and heartache. Everyone Knows You Go Home has been named to a number of 2018 must-read lists, including Harper's Bazaar and Real Simple. The Rumpus wrote, Everyone Knows You Go Home paints an elaborate portrait of the before and after of the immigrant story, as told by those who journey it. Sylvester refrains from lending a voyeuristic gaze on human suffering, and instead writes of trauma as the threshold through which one must pass on the journey toward elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming Natalia.
Hello, everyone. I'm gonna stand while I read because I find it helps me put my voice out there. But thank you all for being here today, and to Chaitali for inviting me to this wonderful gathering, and to Malvern for hosting. I had the pleasure of coming for the first one, and then I was out of town for the second one. But I just immediately, when Chaitali mentioned the idea back in December that this was going to be a regular thing, I just thought, what an amazing idea! What a wonderful way to just bring, all these different communities together, and all these different communities that are really centering such important issues of the day, and having a space and a lens through which we talk about them. Thank you. I usually read the first opening, the opening chapter of the book, but today I wanted to read something from a little bit further down in the book. And it turns out I didn't mark it. Okay, one second. I thought I had the bookmark. I must have fallen. Sticky notes aren't that sticky. Let's see.
This exact thing happened at Texas Book Festival.
Did it?
I couldn't find the spot that I was.
It's really, yeah, well, what I will do while I glance through these pages, I will say the book opens on the Day of the Dead, and it's the day that Martin and Isabel have just gotten married, and Martin's father, who is dead, appears before them. And since he abandoned Martin when he was a child, there's really nobody in his family who wants to speak with him, except for Isabel, who is, his new daughter-in-law and very curious to learn about his past. And so the book throughout really traces both the present storyline, and then it also goes into the family history, kind of trying to uncover that. And so I want to read from a chapter that I want to find right away. That it's actually, let's see, 86, I'm going for 86. Yeah, almost there. I want to read a chapter from in which Enda is Martin's mother, and so the story goes back and traces how Martin's mother, Enda, and Omar, who is the spirit, how they originally came to the U.S. And in this chapter, they've been in the U.S. a few years by now, and since they crossed the border from Mexico into Texas, they've been living in the country undocumented, and now they're about to enter a new phase of their status, you could say. So this is chapter 38, and at this moment in time, Martin is about 5 years old. So it's October 1986. It wasn't just the word. It was that she so often felt like one. On the radio, on the evening news, in the headlines struck in bold capital letters, Enda was reminded that she no longer belonged anywhere. Sometimes she imagined herself not as an alien, but as an astronaut, floating between worlds so far apart that her voice got lost in the middle. There was hope again, but she didn't want it. For more than a year, the government had bounced around plans to give papers to families like hers, legalized, as they called it, as if a living person breathing this air in this corner of the world were against the laws of nature. In their big house on a big hill, the men and women of the House and the Senate threw together all their ideas on citizenship and who should have it. They tossed it back and forth among themselves, fixing this, bargaining on that, until Enda felt dizzy from chasing it in the middle. She was convinced she would never catch it. Tonight, the reporter with the perfectly wavy hair announced the government had agreed on a plan, and President Reagan would soon sign it. Enda clicked off the television, leaning against the blank screen. The set was warm, like the hood of a car, and she closed her eyes and took comfort in it. She didn't need to hear the rest of the news, which promised to outline all the requirements and stipulations for a path to citizenship. Not much had changed from the original plan, and she had already memorized the details by heart. "Does this mean we can play now?" Martin asked. She opened her eyes and found him in the center of the room, with Claudita just a few feet behind him on the couch. "Only until dinner," she said. Martin pumped his fist in the air, and as usual, Claudita imitated his movements. She watched him in awe as he pulled out the cables and controllers from the bottom drawer of the unit. Me, she yelled. His fingers moved swiftly as he powered on the game. A familiar tinny tune came on. "I play Mario," Claudita said. "No, you know I'm always Mario." Enda chuckled and turned away from the children as she searched the pantry for a jar of seasoning. This was probably not the best time to tell her son that they had, in fact, almost given him the same name as his favorite character. Poor Claudita would be doomed to play the thin little man with the silly mustache and green coveralls forever. She heard some rustling and muted grunts. The children were playing tug-of-war with Martin's remote control. "Cuidado, or I'll take it back to the store," she said. That silly set had cost so much, Omar told the kids it was worth their next 2 birthdays and Christmases. The game resumed, filling the room with its bubbly sound effects. Enda's favorite was when Mario shot balls of fire out of his perfectly circular hands, the flames bouncing happily across the screen, because the high-pitched whoop reminded Enda of her mother hiccuping. She told this to the kids as she rinsed a couple of tomatoes under the faucet. Martin paused the game. Nuh-uh, really? Really. She goes like this. Ella imitated her mother's wide-eyed expression and covered her mouth with the tips of her fingers. Whoop, whoop, she said, shrugging her shoulders. Your abuela always acts surprised when she hiccups, like it's the first time it's ever happened to her. Clarita stared at her with a blank expression. Out of nowhere, she whispered, hiccups mean I love you. You think so? Her daughter nodded. She climbed onto the couch, her bare feet sinking into the spaces between the cushions as she puffed out her chest. Hiccups mean I love you, she said, louder this time. She shot her arms into the air and her skirt rode up, exposing her soft, round belly. Nuh-uh, that's Martin Jose, Ella said. Stupendous, he said, stupendous. Ella narrowed her eyes at him, but she couldn't help smiling. My little boy, using such big words. It means awesome, amazing, he said. Amazing, Clarita said. Are you just going to repeat everything I say? Are you just going to repeat? But she forgot which words came next. Martin fell to the floor, rolling with laughter. Martin, yeah, enough picking on your sister. Ella handed 3 sets of forks and knives to her son, along with a cluster of napkins. Turn off the Nintendo and set the table, she said. Ha, Clarita said. Tú también, fold the napkins. The children scattered. They had learned this routine long ago, always at their most well-behaved on nights when their father was at work. They had heard her say, wait until your father gets home. So many times, his absence had become more of a threat to them than his presence. Later, she called her friend to come over after dinner. It's a miracle, she said on the phone. They fell asleep after I read them just one book. Minutes later, she was setting the percolator on the stove when Ella heard her friend's light tap at the door. Well? Jessica gripped the back of a chair in the kitchen, looking like she might jump over it. Well, what? Don't tell me you didn't hear the news, Jessica said. Oh, that. That? Not just that, Ella. That could change everything. That means I can finally visit my baby boy and bring him home. Ella sighed, embarrassed this hadn't occurred to her sooner. Of course it does. Jessica's baby boy was a teenager now, but she still spoke of him as if he were a child, waiting for his mother to pick him up from the last place she had left him. He'd been waiting so long now, Ella worried that Agustin's desire to reunite with his mother was waning. Sometimes she would visit Jessica's apartment and catch them on the phone, and she couldn't help noticing the brief pauses, the way that she asked him question after question to fill the silence. The conversation was like a rope she couldn't stop pulling, hoping she would find her son connected to the other end. Have you told him yet, Ella asked, or do you think you'll wait until after you've applied? Why would I wait to share such good news? After all this time, I'm calling him first thing tomorrow night. Friday nights had special discounted rates. Jessica reached across the table to Elda's wrist and gave her a gentle shake. Anda, amiga, don't make me celebrate alone. I'm happy, really. I just don't want to get too excited until it's official. And when will that be? Jessica said. When you apply or when you become a resident alien months after that? Or 5 years later, when you finally apply for citizenship and they hand you the papers during the fancy ceremony? My point exactly. You can wait forever. No, mija, you can wait forever. I'm getting a bottle of tequila on my way home from work tomorrow. Promise you'll share a drink with me? So they did. The next night, Eva and Omar was home to celebrate. They poured shots of tequila into 3 ceramic mugs that Ella had collected for the previous year's community health fairs. The mugs clanged together clumsily as they gave a toast. To good friends, Ella said. New beginnings, added Omar. Jessica's eyes shimmered, their edges pinching together as she smiled. To fucking finally.
So I have some questions about craft and the structure of the book, but I wanted to start by talking about this essay that you wrote that came out in Latina Magazine, and I'm going to tell you all the title. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to go online and read it tonight. It's called Why Saying My Book About Immigration is So Timely Right Now, Erases the Experience of Millions of People. And in this essay, you're talking about this absurd thing that people sometimes say, which is, this is such a great time to be an immigrant writer, and the immigrant writers are having this moment, and your book is, you know, out here taking advantage of this moment. You know, one of the things you say in this essay is there was never a time, certainly in your life, but there was never a time when immigrant narratives were not important. And this other thing that struck me in the essay was talking about, and I think I had not really expressed it this way, but when you expressed it in this way, I kind of realized my whole condition. But, you know, as an immigrant, you know that you're here with permission. You're living here with permission. You're in this country that's your home. You've been here since you were 4. I've been here since I was 2. But we know that we're here because we have permission to live here. We have permission to be here. And we're in this time right now where that permission feels very tentative. And, you know, if you want to talk about the moment immigrants are having, this is a moment actually of like high anxiety and terror and brutality, depending on what kind of immigrant you are, you know, what level of documentation you have and stuff. So I'm going to get to a question, but I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from the essay. The idea that our struggles are relevant only now that our worst fears have come to fruition underscores the biggest blind spot of the white gaze. Our existence, our voices, our struggles, our beauty, our pain are real whether or not white people see our humanity. We are not that proverbial tree falling in the woods, made true only by their perception of us. Framed by this narrow point of view, we are seen, but also suddenly discovered, which is a dangerous way to be perceived. It is a minefield of good intentions that result in more harm. When you think you have discovered something, you feel entitled to control it. Perhaps if more marginalized people were being amplified decades ago, we wouldn't be here now. Perhaps if the quiet hierarchy of voices that assumes a wide mainstream audience is a white audience were being chipped away earlier, we wouldn't be facing a reemergence of white supremacists. So, one thing I would like to ask you about is, you know, I think that there is something very unhealthy in the publishing literary world where, you know, like, so everybody approaches it in this scarcity model, like, you know, there can only be a few Latinx writers, there can only be a few, you know, if that's been done, and it's, you know, particularly for marginalized writers, that's the sort of the attitude, and I think we do it to each other too. I mean, I've had like South Asian writers tell me what I should be writing.
Right.
So what, and then this whole, you know, concept of permission, and I was thinking, you know, like one thing that we need to do, what we can do, is write without permission and live without permission. So how do you do that? That's my question.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
That was a longer, very long weekend.
Yeah. No, I think you have to slowly chip away at least for me, like in my journey, I feel that I've had to slowly, a significant part of that journey has been even realizing that I'm imposing that permission on myself, or those boundaries and these rules. Because, you know, when I started writing, even when I was like 4 or 5, it was, and all the books that I read were like white narratives and white characters, and so that's what I wrote. And it was this sense of, because like, and I did it thinking like, well, that's what a book is. It's a story about like white people, and nobody's writing stories about me, and so it didn't feel like it would be a legitimate thing to do. And then you realized I realized even after, like when I got to college, I started writing, you know, studying creative writing, writing like my senior thesis, which is what eventually became my first novel. There was this moment when I also realized, like, I'm still writing what I think this literary establishment wants me to And so it's like you have to first become aware of those boundaries there before you, because so much of it is just internalized. That, like, for me, I'm just grateful for the writers who started to question, like, well, why are you writing towards this gaze? Like, why do you feel these stories matter more than others? You know, why do you feel yours aren't worth telling? And then not only then the added complication of that is once we do tell our stories, though, like, who are we telling them for? Because there is this fascination with our suffering that is considered like the measure of authenticity. You know, like this, like an authentic immigrant story must be all about suffering and must have certain elements in the story, and that's like, who is setting that? You know, who is saying that? And so when we like start to like kind of chip away at that, a few things happen. Like, I find that more and more, like when you're talking about like the singular writers that are uplifted, it's because they, like, to some extent, like, we all have to be tiptoeing and seeing where we play that game, because we're like, sometimes it feels like you can own your story, but only to the extent that it makes the like white editor comfortable, you know, or this like white literary establishment comfortable. And I do feel that changing, but in a strange way. Like, I feel that now, ever since after the election happened, there's this more performative aspect in which people like enjoy, like, they like being called out because then it's a public opportunity to be able to say, yes, I'm listening and I want to do better. But sometimes it is still performative, because then do they in fact do better? You know? And so, like, I mean, it's so tricky. Like, and how to, like, for me, I found that we end up having to push back against it at almost every turn, in even small ways. Like, so my editor for this book is a woman of color, but at one point when it got to copy editing, I had an editor who wasn't, and she wrote, she highlighted the word coyote, and she said, I don't think your audience would understand what this film is. And I wrote back, who do you think my audience is? Like, you know, and so then I went back and changed so she was like, well, at least leave some context. And so then I went back and realized that there were other instances in which I had said smuggler. And so then I went back and changed all of them to and I was like, they can figure it out. You know, context is there. But it was such a small comment, and yet it said everything. Because I just thought, like, how come we're thinking of that reader first, and we're not, like, you know, I'm thinking, well, I want to write this for people who would understand it and recognize so much in it, and not just in that one word, but like just the whole book. And you know, it's a conscious effort, and it's like, you know, constantly. It takes like almost constant vigilance, which I think is really unfortunate, because like the publishing of a book and to finally get a story out there, it should feel like this beautiful celebration, and in a lot of ways it often does. But I will say that between my first book and my second book, what I noticed the most, and I think part of it might have been also my own ignorance in the first book, but the second book having come out after everything that's been going on, I just felt like the need to be so much more vigilant and protective of the work, and sometimes that would leave me really exhausted and drained, and like, when I was just kind of like, how come, you know, like, how come POC writers have to be also, like, or any marginalized writer has to constantly be on this defense, and yet, like, you know, like white male, cis, hetero, Christian male, you know, can just write a book and celebrate it. You know?
I mean, I think that something that happens in the publishing world is that they don't know who the readers are. They don't know actually who is out there reading. And, you know, I think there's a lot of like infantilizing readers, and like, you know, like there was some, like, there were two initials that referred to Mexico City, and I didn't know what it meant. I looked it up on Google, and I, you know, there's like stuff where people can look up stuff now. You know, people, they need to give readers
And well,
more credit, right?
right, and I mean, I spent my whole life looking stuff up, you know,
Yeah.
so how come, like, we learn and grew from that in a lot of ways. But also internalize this idea that nothing's being tailored for us. And we can't expect it to ever be.
Yeah. And I think, so we should talk about the fact that you did start this book before Trump. I mean, if novelists could actually whip up a book, that responds to a moment, that would be great. And I know that we talked about some of the journey of this book where you actually switched agents. You, I think at your launch you said that some editors, wanted you to take out some of the quotidian elements, just sort of the chapter that you read of, kids, what happens in this
Right.
living room as, this child is playing a video game, and you remain firm about why you have those in there. And, I just really, I wasn't sure that I would have the same, that's something I'm struggling with. Do I have that same, confidence in my work, and, do I know why I'm doing this, or am I, swayed by somebody who's more powerful than me? How did you, did that come naturally to you, or was that a struggle?
No, I mean, it was always, it was a struggle for sure. It was a struggle because it's always been there, and I felt like, at least this time though, I felt it mattered more than I pushed back. For example, my first book was set entirely in Peru and had entirely Peruvian characters. And at one point, when my first agent was shopping it around, she told me that there was this one editor who was interested in it, and except they were wondering if I would include either American characters, which I say in quotes because I'm South American in America, but they wanted to include either American characters or that they go to the U.S. at one point. And I remember at the time, so this was 2012, and I'm embarrassed to say I considered it, because in my head I was like, well, that would make it more marketable, wouldn't it? And thankfully I didn't do it, but because by that time we were thinking about it and all that, and then my actual publisher was like, we love it. And so I was like, awesome, I can publish this book the way I want it, But then the more I thought of that, over the years, it started to anger me so much that when somebody says something, you come up with a perfect comeback 15 minutes later, and you're like, oh, I should have said that. I think that in that sense, by the time this started happening with this book, I was ready. I was like, okay, you're gonna try this again? Okay, let's see if you. And so it did, and it started it happened in the sense that first of all, I had to part with my agent for the second book because she just wasn't feeling it, and she had felt we just really weren't seeing eye to eye on it at all. And then I found a new agent, and I say that, but it wasn't easy. And she started shopping around the book, and you're right, there were editors who were we're interested in it, but can we get rid of more of the day-to-day stuff? And one editor even said, can we make it more bombastic? Which just shocked me to my core. And then others kind of hinted that there just wasn't enough happening, or it didn't feel realistic because they didn't think the characters were going through enough. But what they meant was going through enough pain. And I was kind of how do you not see, if you're not seeing what they're going through already, and you kind of want me to just add more just for the hell of it, just to make the plot more page turning or heart pounding, I think that's cruel writing. I am attached to my characters. I love them. I'm not going to make them suffer for no reason. I think that's another way of this really strange way of talking about the craft of fiction when we talk about conflict, when we say okay, so put your character in a situation and how do you make their day so much worse? Or how do you mess up their life? Or, and all that. And I'm just thinking to myself well, my character is already going through a lot, and I'm it just feels like such a privileged thing to be able to say. Because maybe for you, maybe this one character, you're messing up her life, she can't remodel her kitchen or something. But for my characters, it means they're going to get deported. It's just night and day, and I'm not going to just make their lives worse for this weirdly fetishing of, or fetish, I can never say that word right, but you know what I mean?
I think it's not being able to see
They're human.
these people as full human beings.
Yeah.
Like that we can only see them as people who are suffering, like dying in the
Right.
desert, and not, people
Yeah.
who are also like, having domestic arguments and,
Yeah. Yeah. But it, like, sorry to,
yeah.
but to go back to your question, it helped a lot that I always had, like, I mean, every time I would object to something, and I'd be like, actually, no, like, actually, I'm not comfortable with that, and all this, like, my agent and eventually my editor always had my back. And I think, and that matters, and it matters that, like, that my editor was a woman of color. It matters that my agent is a white woman who's listening and wants to, like, do her part to really get these voices amplified on their terms, so.
So I want to talk a little bit about Omar. So Omar is the spirit who appears on the wedding day or the Day of the Dead, and would you read the first line?
I love that I'm flipping the pages as if I don't have it memorized already. Okay. They were married on the Day of the Dead, El Día de los Muertos, which no one gave much thought to in all the months of planning until the bride's deceased father-in-law showed up in the car following the ceremony.
So that line has always been the first line of the book.
Yeah.
And I've been reading a lot of interviews with Natalia, and so you were sitting in the library, it came up. So,
Yeah.
I mean, Omar to me seemed, what struck me as I was reading is like he's the ultimate invisible person, he's actually like, that's one of the threads of the novel, is that Isabel has to try to get the rest of the family to see him. And is that, not that it's like directly metaphorical, but I'm thinking about like just the invisibility of immigrants who have like, they're our neighbors, they're just existing with us, but so many people just, they do not see them. And when, kind of Trump started talking about them, like he's the person that's like making them visible in this way that's like so horrifying.
Yeah.
So I don't know if invisibility was something that you were thinking about when you were writing it, or when you were writing his character.
So I think that initially it wasn't like a conscious thing, because I feel like the first draft is like, you just write, like at least for me, my first draft is just discovery, and then I look back and see like, what am I trying to say here, and then, but I mean, that's the kind of beautiful thing about writing, right, is that like, you don't have to know exactly what you're trying to say, but the writing in a way almost tells you what you believe, like you discover it through that translation of like mind to paper, at least, and so it made sense to me, like I was like, yeah, definitely invisibility, and also just his journey. Like, his journey is one that he's crossed over from the dead into the land of the living. It's not an easy journey that he's made, and yet he arrives and nobody, like, he's turned away by his family, by like the people he hopes would welcome him the most. And there was this one moment where I was kind of like, oh my God, this is what we do. Like, this is what this country does to immigrants, and to so, like, and especially to, like everything that that had been, at the time, there was, I think at the time I was like kind of close to like the end of the first draft of this, was when that summer that it was really in the news about like the really high level of unaccompanied children coming over from Central America, and like dehumanizing, even just like the way people would say like, oh, a surge of immigrants or whatever. It's like, no, these are like thousands of lives of children, and like individual souls. But yeah, and so that idea, and the other part of the invisibility to me was just that I didn't feel like the stories that I'd grown up seeing and like hearing and living in my own community and like friends, family, or even people who would share their stories with me. I didn't see that reflected as much in like what we call like, you know, the more mainstream, you know, and I say that because we so often hear like people say nobody's writing about this, and it's like, no, actually our voices have been here, and like there are people writing about this, and I'm not like gonna pretend like I'm the first one. But in terms of like who gets amplified the most on this like very national level of the awards, and like you said, gets raised up to this pedestal of one narrative, like, it didn't reflect my experience, and so it did feel like those experiences to a certain extent had become like invisible and unheard.
So, I mean, having like said all this, and, you know, I do think that immigrant narratives have always been important. At the same time, I'm very glad that this book is out now, you know, that it's now a part of the literary culture. And, you know, I think there's this way in which like things are being debated and discussed at the cultural level, at the artistic level, that maybe like it's facilitating discussions on the, you know, like in families or in workplaces. And I mean, just like this past year, like year and a half, I mean, think of like all these cultural moments like Me Too and, you know, the Colin Kaepernick, Michelle Wolf's monologue that just, you know, the Kanye's tweets, the Childish Gambino music video, like the art is responding to things that is like breaking open it's like widening the debate that like people like on media are not having. Like they're not saying the things that Michelle Wolf said that, you know, that should have been said. And so, but at the same time, like novels are like not really playing that role. So, and I don't know if this conflict that I've had as a novelist is like you have the told amount of time that it takes to write a novel,
right.
And then you've got these things right now that are happening so fast that you feel like you need to respond to. Is that something that is a struggle for you, or like, how are you seeing yourself right now as a novelist, and are you feeling like you can respond to these things going on right now as a novelist, or is that something that's just is writing a novel just a different process?
No, I think it could be both, but I just think it won't necessarily look the way we expect it to. Like, I mean, I've had people like ask me like, oh, did you write this book in response to Trump, like I said, and I'm just kind of like, okay, like you don't know how slowly publishing works, and B, the act of writing something like a novel, like that's commitment. That's every day waking. At least for me, it's like every day waking up earlier than I would ever normally wake up because I'm not a morning person. You know, thinking and obsessing over the characters and their lives, and being excited about their lives, and like falling in love with them, and then having heartbreaks, all these different things. And I do feel like, why would I devote all that energy to someone who hates me? You know, like. And as a response, like as a rebuttal, where I felt like I wanted to write this book for people who, I felt like the best way I can do this is to write it as an act of love, you know, and like and I find myself like now, like I'm working on new things, and I kind of keep going back to this place of like my way of resisting everything is to reclaim my joy. You know, and have faith that that's going to be powerful too. You know, and that's not to say that there aren't places, there's other things, like there's other places where I can resist out of anger, you know, and resist like to make more direct change, you know, but it can be like separate, you know, and I, not okay, separate's the wrong word. The hope is that people would read and, you know, that would help, you know, affect change too. But I feel like if I start out from that place of like anger and just centering the oppressor rather than centering like like my own community that I would want to protect, and think of their needs first, and think like, well, what do we need to see? Like, what do we need to celebrate? What do we need to protect? What do we need to reclaim? And trust that there's also power in that. I don't know, I feel like that's how I want to choose to write.
I think that's very helpful for me. I think I'll ask one or two more questions, and then I'm sure people in the audience have some questions. So this is a braided narrative. It takes place, it's two different timelines, and I think I read that you had started sort of alternating, but then you decided to write like one timeline as one block and the other timeline as another block. So why did you, and then as I was reading it, I thought, it would be really interesting to read like that one timeline continuously and then read the other one continuously. So, I guess just what made you make that decision, and what surprised you in that process?
Yeah, well, the first surprise was that I just couldn't write it the way I was writing it. Like I said, I was just writing it alternating, wasn't working. But the reason it wasn't working was because I didn't know the characters' pasts. And so if I didn't know their pasts, and I didn't know their motivations, I didn't know their secrets, I didn't know like what drives them and why they're doing what they're doing. And then the more that so then I went back to writing the past narrative first, and that became really important to me because I got to learn all the things that they're not telling one another. And the characters' secrets actually became really important to me in this book. And not for this purpose of like, when am I going to reveal them? Like, just for the purpose of like respecting that they each had something that maybe they're not willing to share. And like maybe I'm not even owed them sharing it with me or with the reader or with each other. And it kind of, like, I realized I was also just exploring this silence of just intergenerational trauma, like the secrets we carry, like even when we don't talk about them out loud, and even if we don't ever tell each other, we feel the weight of them. We feel the absence of, like, this connection. We feel the gaps in, like, there's that place we can't go again, and we're going to pretend that it's not there, but it is. And so that became really important. And then what ended up surprising me, I guess, the more that I braided it, like by the end I realized that the ending kind of, by the time you get to the end of one character, it's like the beginning of another, and I thought, like, wow, like, this is cyclical, and this is the way life and death is, and that made a lot of sense to me.
I think in your book, I've read both your novels now, and there's a very skillful complexity that you bring. It's not a hard novel to read, but there's a complexity to it that, I don't know how you do it, and I don't think I even want to know how you do it. I think this is more of a comment where, the things that this family does not know about each other, and the fact that at the end, it's not like that's all resolved.
Yeah.
That is very real to me, and, I think that's why I still think about the characters from Chasing the Sun. I think that's why they live with me so much, they have these same, flaws and hang-ups and, not wanting to know things, that is, we know people like that, we live with people like that. So I guess that's just a comment.
That means a lot though, because I remember early on when I was writing, I would constantly get when I was first showing my work to people in publishing, I often got the comment that it was too quiet. And in this weird way, like in the industry, that's like this code word for just boring or not enough happening or all this. But what happens when your characters are actually quiet, you know, and like how, and that was something, but I was like, and to me, I was like, but it makes sense. Like we also, there's, just because someone's keeping something doesn't mean there's not life underneath, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I've gotten that criticism as well. I think, well, I would like to know what you're working on now, and I think then we'll open it up. I have other questions, but we'll have to, I think I'll wait for the next vote.
No, so I'm working on something new, but I'm also in a weird place where I'm not talking about it. I will say I gave myself a really crazily self-imposed deadline, so I'm silently like freaking out about it. But it is something I've been working on since about, like for a couple years now. And so yeah.
A novel.
Yeah, hopefully.
And,
Let's just
anything good you're reading?
Oh my gosh, so much. I just started reading Nafisa Thompson-Spires Heads of the Colored People short story collection, and I'm only like on the first story, but it's amazing. And recently, like I read Julie L's collection. She's a poet, and she wrote a collection of debut. She calls it a memoir in poems, and it's all about her experience as a Korean adoptee, but really looking at it from the lens of the adoptee rather than the parents. Her also reclaiming that. Let's see what else. Gosh, so many. I always blank out these questions, but
Those are two good
yeah.
recommendations. Are there questions from the audience or?
I haven't read your book yet, but I was just curious about your inspirations for each of their personalities, because it sounds like you know, yes, they're immigrants and they have a lot of overlap with your personal experience, but they are also, my intuition tells me that they're also very different than what you have lived throughout your life in many ways. So I was just curious to know what your inspirations have been, and how did you get to research their lives and their experiences if you didn't live through those same experiences even though you are an immigrant?
Sure, yeah, no, that's a really great question. Like my characters are Mexican immigrants and I'm a Peruvian immigrant. And I've certainly grown up around an immigrant community that's very diverse. And so I've like heard, like I feel like growing up, I agree, like it was always so fascinating to me the ways that our stories differed and also the things that they shared in common. But like when I was writing this story, so I kind of feel like a lot of it was like, it's like a mixture, right? Like I think of, like Anna, for example, in less literal ways, I think she really is very much a reflection of like my own family and just that emotional journey of like the constant anxiety and uncertainty that like I grew up around, that I saw my parents navigating through as we like when we were young, like when I was younger and trying to kind of navigate the immigration system. That is something that I'm pretty sure I brought to the page. But then but then there's also like people in my life who either share their experiences with me. You know, like you talk to people throughout your whole life. You find out like they tell you about their stories, and then you know, or even people in my own family. Like I was very aware growing up how different even somebody in my own family, like how different their journey was, only simply because like we had different documentation status, you know. And so that also informed a lot of it, but there definitely did come a point where I have a journalism background, and so I did a lot of research and I did interview people like who had been through like more, you know, similar journeys as my characters, and I say interview, but like I also feel, okay, so I think in journalism you have like the very crucial aspect of attribution, right? So a journalist will tell someone's story and then they tell, you know, you have the name of that person, you know it's that person's story. And the journalist as a writer is not necessarily claiming that story or like giving like the same, it's not assumed that that's their story, right? And so when I was doing research, I really didn't want to just talk to people for their stories and then just use it, in this book. Like, it was like, I thought of it as like, that's their story. And actually when we spoke, I really never even took notes. It was really just, can we just talk? And, and I'll ask you things and you tell me what you want to tell me. And then I'll, whatever I feel like I've learned from that, I'll use it to try and imagine new characters, and new experiences. Because, like, to me, it was important that that was theirs, and it's not my place to just plug it into this book and pretend to, so, yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? Oh, yeah, I'm gonna let you.
I have a question sort of came up that question a little bit. As you were talking about the expectations that the industry sort of puts on you, I wonder, as a woman, as a writer of color, as a woman, do you feel that the industry expects you to insert a little more of your nonfiction and your narrative into the stuff that you're writing about? And that heard that, stories are juicier when you're coming from your own direct experience. Do you ever feel that people want to hear more about your experiences within the fiction that you're writing? Are you struggling with finding the balance between nonfiction and fiction as requested by the industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've noticed that a lot, like in publicity, now that I'm touring for this book and I get asked questions, and I try to be very aware of really trying to answer and navigate that on my own terms, because it often does become an interview that's less about the book, less about the story, less about even craft. Like, we hardly get to talk about craft. I know we've had this conversation before too. Like, when you are a marginalized writer, like, people they want to hear like the nonfiction aspect of it, which means they want to ask very personal and sometimes hurtful questions, not realizing that they are, because they're requiring you to just lay yourself bare, not knowing that actually, like, that's why you wrote the book, so I try to in any way I can kind of like steer those conversations on my own terms, and it's not always easy, but it's something I've noticed more and more touring this book. My first book was actually based on an experience that my family went through, and what it was is that it's about like a family who goes through kidnapping, and my grandfather was kidnapped and bitten when I was like 3, and I didn't remember any of it, but it was like my writing, it was trying to uncover that family history. And I realized like people often wanted me to talk about that, and I had I wanted to have a point until which this is the line I don't cross. And in a lot of ways, even though that was based on like family history, I feel like this is a much more personal book, because like the experiences that inspired it and that I saw, like I had either direct I had more actual like personal experiences with it, and not and actual like, or even just people around me and people who I love had those experiences. But it's just, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, okay. Now I'm rambling, so just let me on.
You are creating, going into a new process. Do you feel fresh, or like does that exhaustion come with you, and how do you navigate that? Is it your exhaustion?
Right.
Yeah, like I'm a writer, and I wonder if I would resent it, if I would tap into it, if it's a tortured relationship with your exhaustion, or is it?
That's a good question. Huh.
I mean, because obviously, like white male, cis, etc., right, aren't navigating that same kind of thing, so they're approaching their craft in a different way.
Absolutely. I think that you feel the weight of your craft quite a bit, in the sense of like for example, I have characters who are not great examples of immigrants in this book, And it really sucks to think that that might be used and weaponized against, in someone's mind as a way to say, like, see, that's why we don't like them, But then there does have to come a certain point where I think, like, that's on the reader, and that's, like, if they can only pluck one character or one or two characters and use that to, like, obscure the full humanity of every character, like, I can't fix that. Like, that's just something wrong with their humanity. And I get really frustrated with that term of, like, are you trying to humanize people? Because I'm like, no, they're human already. Like, maybe it's time, like, that people who are actively dehumanizing us think about humanizing themselves, for showing their humanity. But I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, I'm sure there are times when I'm really, because I don't write every day, and there's days where I'm really tired and it just doesn't work. And I'm sure there are days I've had days like that. Like, I've had days where it was just like, oh, here's a bunch of interviews to do for PR, and you get sent all these questions, and inevitably they're like, why do POC voices matter? And like, how many times do I have to validate that question? Like, how many times do I have to tell you why I matter? Like, that's you're constantly, like, reminding me that in your mind I don't then. And so, like, it becomes really exhausting, and there's days where I get really frustrated because I think, where is the energy left for the writing? I feel like maybe that's why I write early in the morning, thinking about it out loud, but also I try to really just sustain myself with the joy of those moments when the writing does work, because there are times where it's just like, oh my god, like, this character, like, is just revealing themselves to me, and it's the most beautiful feeling, and I try to hold on to that.
I love that, with the character revealing themselves to you, and it kind of goes into my question. One of my favorite parts of the book is when Omar just shows up, and I thought about you, and I wondered which of those characters just would show up to you regularly, like you feel like they're in the car with you. And I just wanted to know you on that.
It was definitely Omar first. He came through pretty, like, clear. And I think what resonated with me so much about him was that he's dead, and yet he's so, like, lively. And I loved the duality of him, and it really inspired me, and it kind of helped me, like, think of the ways that, he kind of, like, inspired me to be like, oh, I want the rest of the book to feel like him, like, in the sense that it's embracing all those dualities. So it's like, yeah, even when things are hard, there's still joy, and I really wanted to be able to get that across. The other character that I really went back to pretty easily was Marisol. And she's not, like, one of the most, like, main characters, but, like, to me, she was very much like I think sometimes, like, okay, I don't know how to explain this other than her story came a little more complete to me, in the sense of, like, oh, I didn't feel like I had to worry about her as much, because, I had faith that she was going to figure things out.
She is that was a very interesting, I was trying to imagine, she's not a part of that, like, main universe, but I was trying to imagine the novel without her, and I just really couldn't. And I do want to, like, I encourage everybody to read this book, but the scenes in the desert, the scenes of the crossing, just are, they're very special, and like I think about the scenes in your book, and, like, what's just, what makes people take that journey, and like, just the things that are the actual, like, danger of that journey, and what compels people, and then, like, that triumph when you've made it. Like, I felt like that was something that I was thinking a lot about, but then, then it's not over, then you're still thinking about, like, go to a hospital? Can you go to a doctor? So, and I think like it makes sense to me when you say like you talk to people and didn't take notes. Like it just felt like a very, these are stories. These are like very organic stories and experiences that people have.
I should clarify that they didn't know what, like, I did tell them why I was talking to them.
Okay.
I don't want it to be like I was just stealthily asking them, because that would be horrible. But yeah, no, they knew, like, why I was asking.
Any other questions?
I don't want to be the question.
It's okay. We'll have, and we can get up in a minute and mingle, and you can ask them about your one question.
Natalia, have you had any of the people that you had conversations with read your book, and have you had any conversations with them after?
Not yet. Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I'm excited. I mean, I look forward to them reading it, but I'm not gonna, like, I can't expect them to if it's not, something, like, A, not everyone is, like, really into novels, and B, like, maybe it's harder, and, I have to kind of just respect their choice. I know about it, though. I thank them and everything. That's all I can do.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Natalia, for talking to me. This has been very illuminating for me. And please buy books, buy Natalia's book. My book is also for sale. And let's just get up and walk.